Civic again? Please let me check your phone.
Civic engagement during the pandemic.
Right. Let's wait for the first person to join us. Are you banana telling anything about it? Okay, people are here. Headroom.
Yes, he did.
Right, welcome to day 2 of the Call of Duty series with me, with Chude, where I'm talking to some of Nigeria's more inspiring journalists, civil society leaders, and public office holders who are working on the front lines of trying to beat Corona and trying to get us back to a new normal after this time. My guest is going to be Innocent Chukwuma, who is Regional Director, West Africa for the Ford Foundation. Now, Innocent Chukwuma is joining Instagram simply for this chat. Like, he has never been on Instagram. This is his first Instagram engagement, certainly his first Instagram live. So I'm going to be very patient because it might take him a bit of time to get in. But once he joins us, he should be joining us any moment now. We will start the conversation about civil society in a time of pandemic. Civil society in the time of pandemic. While we are doing that, while we're waiting for Innocent Chukwuma to join us, if anybody wants to join this live and talk about the kinds of things that civil society should be engaged in at this time, please just wave at me, tell me you want to join, and let's have that conversation while we wait for Mr. Innocent Chukwuma to join us. If you want to talk about, I see Mr. Dipo here. I don't know if to drag him up here while I'm waiting for Innocent Chukwuma. If you would like to join me for us to talk about this while we're waiting for Innocent, just wave. Just put a comment. Just say something and I'll invite you and we can start the conversation before the conversation. Anybody? Any takers? Any takers? Any takers? Someone to join me. Let's start this conversation before Innocent Chukwuma joins us. Anybody? Anybody? Because I can't really see who's on the call and who's not while I'm here. For those of you who are just joining us, we are waiting for Innocent Chukwuma, who is the Regional Director of the Ford Foundation for West Africa. We're waiting for him to join us to have a conversation about civil society and activism during a pandemic. He's not here yet. I mentioned that this is his first time on Instagram. This is his first Instagram live ever. This is his first Instagram live ever. So I'm sure it takes some getting used to. So while we're waiting for him to work out those kinks and join us, I'm trying to see if I can get a conversation with any of the people who are presently watching. Let's talk about activism and advocacy at this time. And then when Innocent Chukwuma has successfully logged in, then he can join the conversation. So one of those who are listening to me, if you'd like to start that conversation while we wait for the guest, please let me know by putting a comment or waving at me, and then I'll invite you, and then we'll start the conversation while we wait for Innocent Chukwuma. Is there anybody bold enough to join me on this live? Somebody, anybody, don't leave me hanging. Anybody to join me while we wait for Innocent Chukwuma to get on this call and talk about civil society and activism during a pandemic. Okay. Can we call and find out where the guest is? Oh, okay. Chinasa, I saw you. Oh, yeah. Okay. He has joined. He has joined us.
He has joined us. So,
okay. Hi. How are you, sir?
Okay. Hi. How are you, sir? I'm fine. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you for doing this. But now,
thank you for
as you
doing
just
this. But
signed
now,
in, the
as you
guest
just signed
came
in,
up.
the guest came up.
So,
It's all right. No problem. It's my pleasure, sir.
thank you. Thank you for joining.
It's my pleasure.
Stop the show. Stop the signing. Yes, the guest is here. Yes, the guest is here. Hello, sir.
Hello, Chude.
Good evening.
Trying to get this thing to.
Yeah.
Are you hearing me? I'm actually not hearing you.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
You can't hear me. Well,
I'm trying.
your voice is faint.
Trying to get this thing
Okay.
to work.
Oh, fantastic. Is it better now, sir?
Yes, I'm hearing you now.
Okay. I can hear you much better. Well, welcome. The screen has gone dark.
Thank
I think
you.
something is covering it. Something is covering the screen.
Is it clear
There
enough?
must be some. No, we can't see. Something it was very clear before. Okay, right. I think it's facing the opposite direction or something.
Let me see.
Okay,
Fine now.
great. Fantastic. Well, welcome. Two welcomes. Welcome to this conversation and welcome to Instagram.
Thank you. Thank you. You guys made me join Instagram. I said I wasn't going to do it.
I know.
But here
I know. I know. That's the Adamaleko and the AIE people can do magic.
Yeah.
So Instagram is where we come to when we want to temporarily forget Nigeria's problems.
Okay. Happy to join you.
Fantastic. Okay, so the theme is civil society and activism in a pandemic. And it's a 45 minutes conversation, even though we started a bit late. And so I'm going to go right in. Much of Nigeria's more impactful activism has been done physically on the streets, with large-scale protests, large-scale civic engagement, on the streets, action with the communities. We're now in a period where all of that is difficult for so many reasons. So much of the advocacy we've been seeing has been palliative, distributing food, distributing health material. But I think we understand that at a time like this, holding government accountable on several levels becomes even more important at a time when, it's difficult to access information. It's difficult. Many government offices are closed down. How can people who are used to an on-the-ground, in-your-face engagement still be effective at a time like this?
Great. I would like to take the discussion back a little bit, even before the era of street activism and all that started. Something informed it. And in my view, what informed it was a process of development of mindset and civic orientation that began for many of us in the student movement. And it was a process that led to critical thinking, questioning everything that comes from government with a view to understanding whether they have been carefully thought out to factor in every segment of the Nigerian population and not just the vocal minority, the elites, the middle class, the rich class, and all of that. But what about ordinary poor people on the streets and in inner cities and rural communities, have those policies and programs of government factored them into the thinking and the planning process, and beginning our activism from that. So what that does to you is inculcates critical thinking in you, that it then informs your activism. But what we have seen over the years, especially beginning with 1999, is what you might call compliance activism. Activism of complying with directives from those in authorities. And interestingly, the languages we used in the past and the language we use now also helps you to understand where that is coming from.
Right.
During our time in the student movement, we talked about political education. And political education is an education that enables you question the system that underpins the oppression people are experiencing in the society. But today we talk about voter education, which is complying within a system that have been set up and actually rigged against the people. So from inception, you are just going out there to comply. And fast forward that thinking to now that we have COVID-19 and all the restrictions in our way of doing what we usually do in the past, which is mobilize and go on the street, you begin to see how this compliance mentality also impacted and affected the way we responded to the policies government came out with in response to COVID-19. And what were those policies? One, government said we should all lock down. Nobody should go anywhere, stay at home, and all of that, so that we flatten the curve or whatever. Nobody said, well, hang on a minute. We have an economy in which over 90%, in fact, in some communities, it's actually 100% of everybody is involved in the informal economy. And what is this informal economy? It's a daily hand-to-mouth engagement, barely surviving, in which case, if you stop working for a day and nobody brings food to your house, you will starve. And the question is, how long can you stop working, stay in your house in an environment where foods are not being brought to you, or even when you get it so paltry that it cannot take you more than a meal, and you're expected to lock down, this is where I feel civil society actually failed in response to this COVID-19, because we should have interrogated that policy of lockdown to really hold government accountable, put their foot to the fire. If we lock down, how are you going to feed over 100 million Nigerians that are trapped in that below poverty line, and begin to push them to ensure that if you are going to do palliative, it's not palliative for 500,000 or 1 million. We are looking at 100 million. And if you don't have the resources to feed 100 million people, can we rethink this lockdown in such a way that it will factor in the livelihood? So this is where the discussion needs to start before we even go about the mechanism and the tools of engaging at this period of time where we cannot go to the streets.
Fantastic. This just makes me remember my trips to your office just to listen. And I'm like, I need to do that again. Because you're taking, as usual, you're taking the question beyond the question. So let's back it up a bit and talk about, I like the idea of compliance activism. And that's something that has constantly, I have a conversation with Dr. Abakoba on Thursday, and this was something that he was talking about. Is compliance activism not almost inevitable when there is a democracy? So I was discussing this with a few friends a few days ago, that I just watched two movies, Suffragettes, about the women's rights movement in, I think, 18th century Britain. I watched Selma, about Dr. King's activism in a snapshot of time. And I was comparing that with the Black Lives Matter movement at this time and the relative ineffectiveness in terms of objective outcomes from the modern movement. and say, is it not easy to not comply when there is a particular enemy, when there is a clear-cut adversarial influence, whether it's slavery, whether it's an apartheid government, whether it's colonialists, whether it's dictators, literal dictators. And then it's very clear who the enemy is, and that this is from the get-go, an illegitimate system. But in a democracy, especially one that has all the apparatus of a democracy, even if it is in effect sometimes not like that, isn't it more difficult to move from, to not be compliant because the enemy that you are fighting is not so clear-cut?
Yeah, so that's one way of looking at it. Again, I like to take it back to the fundamentals. Whether you engage in compliance or you engage in critiquing the policies that you were asked to comply with, the approach you take depends on your understanding of the fundamental contradictions in society. So whether we're in a democracy or you are in a dictatorship, if you understand the society as eternally engaged in the fight of hegemonies, hegemonies of those who want to capture the resources in the society for the benefit of their own class, and hegemony of those who want to fight for the downtrodden. So if you understand it that at every point in time, society is locked in this eternal battle where you have to choose on whose side are you fighting, whether it's in a democratic regime or in a dictatorial regime, it becomes clear for you, because that is the lens in which you say, this policy that has come out, who is it benefiting? Is it benefiting the generality of Nigerians, or some people who want to be protected from the rest of us and who can afford to be locked down in their houses for as long as it takes to rout out this epidemic, and they will be fine, and then the rest will not be fine? So if the rest will not be fine, then you have to do something, and in doing something, this is where you factor in whether you are democratic or not. Yes, if you are fighting under a dictatorial government, certain tools and approaches are required. But if you are engaged in a democracy, democracy also has its own tools for battling unpopular policies. So I'm not saying people should go and throw stones or begin to burn tires and all of that. There are platforms. You have a National Assembly. You have different parties representing different tendencies, assuming that all of them represent different tendencies that can be engaged. The least of all being that your voice should be heard. When government said lockdown, did anybody say, hang on a moment, there are alternative ways of doing this? And you look at what happened in other societies where people actually engage in those alternatives. Where you have, for instance, in Sweden, where an analysis was made based on their social democratic philosophy and approaches. They said, if we lock down, we may be stifling this economy, and if we stifle the economy, it's going to impact disproportionately on the poor and all of that. Can we find a system where the economy can exist side by side, which is an extreme one, and then you have in other places where it's a two-track approach. You have some places where extreme lockdown was required, and then you have other places where an opening. So it requires engagement. And what I'm emphasizing is that we shouldn't take policies of government as if they are ecclesiastical preachments or some holy words from God that cannot be debated. If we had debated this lockdown earlier enough, believe me in confidence, government would have been compelled to put in more resources to address all the needs that we are today crying that they didn't do. So that's one. So it doesn't matter whether you are in a democratic or you are in a dictatorial government. What matters is, are you seeing policies of government as a function of class in our society? That there are people who have influence this policy in a manner that it will serve their interests, whereas the rest of the people who are not represented had no voice, and civil society therefore is required to represent them and bring their own voices to the table, rather than, oh, a policy has come out, ours is compliance. How do we get people to stay at home? How do we get police to behave themselves and not beat up people? And that's the end of our civil
the activity.
society engagement.
Right. I'm going to ask a question, Sam. This is a bit of a, it's just crystallizing in my mind, because one of the beauties of engaging you is that you've operated on several levels of civil society. Yeah, from student activism to on-street activism to running a legacy institution, and now to being on the resource allocation side of it. Is there a possibility that in a society like ours, where activism is largely funder-based, which is that the resources people need often come from funders with very specific thematic areas, and that entire system, of mutual agreement, that it affects the capacity of civil society organizations to be agile, to be able to say, we have organizations. I mean, again, I like using America because most Nigerians pay attention to America, so they can understand. You think of organizations like the Southern Law Poverty Center and all these other organizations have always been grassroots funded, so that they don't depend on institutionals, but they depend on an active engagement with the everyday people. Is it easier for people like that to say, look, there is a pandemic, I don't care what we had planned for the year, what we had approved, what had been funded, this is the new imperative. And if that is the case, if that enables agility, how can civil society space in Nigeria begin to move to such a system, such a possibility?
Very, very, very important questions, because your source of funding has a way of influencing how flexible and responsive you are to the needs on the ground, rather than what you signed off on in terms of grant agreement and all of that. And then there's also a history behind it, because at a point within the civil society movement in Nigeria, there was a time when it was actually funded locally, when you had the dues paying members who held leadership accountable, organized annual general meeting in which they determined the policies of the organization, put their money on the table to fund it, and which made it easier for them to be better able to respond to situations like this. But then there was a historical juncture when groups were confronted with donor funding versus support from members. If you remember, the earliest organizations we had in Nigeria were actually membership based. You had the Civil Liberties Organization, you have the Committee for Defense of Human Rights, and you had MOSOP, which is still struggling today to depend on its members. But at that time, if I can take CLO for instance, where I worked, we had members who were paying dues. And then we started having donor grants and started hiring program officers whose responsibilities were to implement these grants. And over time, members started wondering, why should we continue to pay dues when you have all this money you are raising from grants? And then the program officers who were running these grants said, no, we have signed agreement with these donors. We can only use these monies to do this project. We can't use it to pay for members to come for meetings and all of that. At a point, that broke down. The membership started drifting, and then those who were dependent on donor funding took over dominance, and that became the form of civil society organizing that you are seeing today, and the challenges that they have in responding to the needs of the people as they evolve on a daily basis. But having said that, it's also important to highlight that even within donor funding, I know my organization, Ford now, has actually given all our partners the flexibility they need to apply the funding that we gave them to better respond to developments. But they just have to ask and request that these monies be repurposed for this other thing. But if you don't ask, you may not get that approval. And then you have this power relationship where organizations, once they receive funding, they don't think that they can go back and push back a little on those who are providing the money and say, look at the the situation has changed and we needed to respond differently, which is where I think they need to build that boldness, build that leadership as a collective and make this demand, and they will get the approval to do it.
That's powerful. Okay, so let me move. I have a lot of other questions there, but I'm mindful of the topics. Let me move forward a bit. Essentially, it appears like there is a sense that, you know, the challenge of being alert to hold government accountable, even in the midst of a crisis nobody could prepare for. At that point, there seemed to have been a failure of let me use the word a failure of response. Yeah. Now that has occurred and essentially gave government a wide latitude to begin to take action that has not been vetted. Yeah, that has not even gotten public buy-in. I think people began to wake up only when the Infectious Diseases Act, you know, it's like, okay, no, this is not turning to wrestling. Okay, we need to step up. But two questions. One, because it's important to learn the lesson sometimes while you are in it. If a situation like this were to come up again, that point at which there was a breakdown in response, what would you recommend that people should do the next time? I mean, we'll probably not have a pandemic like this again, but we'll have smaller situations, maybe in states or communities. How would people respond to that? One. And then two, now that we're here, how should we be responding to the challenge of holding governments, spending, legislation, and policy accountable to ensure maximum responsiveness to the needs of people on the street?
Yeah, very important question. I think the first thing to recognize is that because civil society was so atomized, professionalized, and fragmented, no one group felt it was its responsibility to respond to this. Because firstly, people saw it as a health problem. And the health sector in Nigeria is more service-oriented than activist-oriented. So they immediately went into the mode of palliative, you know, to ameliorate sufferings of people. And then the other civil society sort of stayed back. Oh, we are not doing health program. We have no grant to deal with health. And it's when the abuses started from law enforcement angle, or that people who are into holding security agencies accountable suddenly woke up. Oh, work has arisen for us to do, and then they started issuing reports and all of that. And then along the line, people started also seeing this, and it's actually a larger governance question, that systems are breaking down, and really government has no framework of responding, even responding to the most minute of challenges before it's easily get overwhelmed. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that over the past 22 years, we have lost, you know, the kind of platforms that cuts across sectors, that enabled groups in the past to respond, you know, from that holistic perspective. I mean, if it were in the days of CD and other pro-democracy groups and all of that, they would have rallied. If it were in the days of CLO that worked across sectors, they would have rallied. But now we are so atomized that we are waiting for the for the problem to deteriorate to the sector where we claim to be expert before we jump in. So going forward and preparing for a reoccurrence, because this is something that comes periodically, is for us to recognize the importance of having omnibus platforms, CSO platforms, that are there to respond. As far as that issues concerns Nigerian people, there will be a voice ready to champion it. So we need to going back to, you know, building and strengthening pan-Nigeria platforms that are there to respond to issues, irrespective of the dichotomies that donors and donations have tried to create within the citizen sector in Nigeria.
That's powerful. That's an entire conversation on its own, sir. That's an entire, like, we can spend an hour talking about this atomization and professionalization, so to speak. Is it possible? Is this scenario, I mean, I want to assume, I mean, I participate in civil society, so I want to assume that There are smart people who have identified and understand this challenge. Yeah. But have there become, I know that sometimes, again, I was having this conversation with, I think, Bishop Cooker 2 days ago. And, it's always very easy for people. I mean, you understand the complexities of this. So people can say, oh, it's because people are, are biased or whatever. That's why they've not reasoned together. But sometimes there are more structural and systemic challenges that have self-crippled people from responding. If we have these smart people, smart, engaged, passionate, committed people who can understand the reasons why these failures exist, what has stopped this meta organization from happening over the past 20 years? What has stopped this linking of hands, to ensure that beyond the silos, people can respond to national problems, cross-sector problems, cross-functional problems with agility? What has stopped that from actually happening over the past at least 10 years? If I say that maybe there was an adjusting to democracy for the first 5 years post 1999, in the past 10 to 15 years, why has this not happened again?
I would say again, it's a fallout of professionalization. You see, when you become more and more professionalized, you begin to be excessive, if not obsessive, about metrics, about impact. You want to narrow your focus area so that in 12 months, 18 months, or 24-month cycle that donation comes, that you are able to measure and state what you have achieved. And even people quote
Yeah.
all kinds of things, like in Kennedy School, they say you can't manage what you can measure, and then you
Measure.
can't be all over the place and hope to be impactful and all of that.
Yes.
Forgetting that when you are dealing
Yes.
with social issues, there is
Yes.
always gray areas. There's always
Yes.
a leap of faith that is required. You
Yes.
are dealing with phenomena that are constantly evolving, that you
Evolving.
can't pigeonhole, and that something you are doing today might take 10 to 20 years before
Yes.
you see an angle or an end in it. And that
Yes.
if you stop engaging and investing today, that 10, 20 years might even be elongated to 30, 40 years. So what am I saying is this whole short-termism, short-term approach. You also see it in the business world, where shareholders are more excited about short-term results from one financial year to another, forgetting that if you invest for the long term, then you will have a
Yes.
greater yield and a sustainable yield for the long. It's also you
Yes.
see a similar thing in the civil society sector. So it
Yes.
requires certain tools. One, funding is critical. The kind of funding that doesn't require you to tell
Stay
me
in the street.
to the minute number how many people
Yes.
you have fed, how many lives were touched, how many, when I
Yes.
hear people say, oh, with this project, I'm going to impact 1 million, I laugh. I said, do you even know the society you are dealing with? This is an environment where there is not, we say in Nigeria, there's not a dull moment. In January, would you and I believe, even as late as ending of February, would we believe that our life will be turned upside down
Because
today, that we will
yeah.
be locked in one place 24/7? So if you have
Yes.
no control of social processes, why
Yes.
will you promise
Yes.
that you will do ABC? So we need to return. It's actually a conversation that needs to involve those of us who are in donor agencies, the civil society partners, and what is driving this within philanthropy is what is called strategic philanthropy, smart
Yes.
investing.
Yes.
I want
Yes.
to see to
Yes.
the minute details the
Yes.
outcome that my investment is
It's
achieving.
going to.
Just
Yes.
borrowing all these business terms again
Thanks. Yeah.
is the influence of those who made this money in the technology
Silicon
sector
Valley.
revolution, and they think that in social sector you can pigeonhole processes like this. So how
Yes.
do we address it? We need to develop our own homegrown resources that are, just like we say in investment, you need patient capital. In the social sector, we need patient funding, patient capital that will allow us invest for the long term, because we have no way of showing the seeds we are planting today, whether they will yield in 2 or 3 years. Some they even yield 5 years after you have retired the grant and shown that you didn't accomplish what you
Anything.
were asked to accomplish. But few
Yes.
years down the line, you see everything working the way you. So we need to be patient.
Yes.
We need to be long term in the things that we do here.
That's fantastic. I'm going to come forward because that's remarkable. Because I mean, 2 years ago, I came to that understanding. I'm like, look, it's also some kind of empathy and sympathy for the funder. You need to, the funders have certain imperatives, certain impetuses that are beyond Nigeria, so to speak. But I began to realize that the scale of the vision, I mean, even enough is enough Nigeria as it is, was like the scale of the vision or the kind of work we wanted to do when this organization was founded cannot be fit into a quarterly report. So it's at that point it's like, you know what, but I also understand how this donor system is incentivized. So it's like, you know what, Chude, if you want to achieve these outcomes, you need to go and find your own resources, so to speak, and say you understand the limitations of this system. You're not criticizing it because it does some good. It does a lot of good. But you say, look, social change requires a certain kind of fluidity. And maybe for that, you need to find a different kind of resource to ensure that kind of fluidity. But that we'll leave that aside. Right now, sir, we'll come to the specifics. In terms of, some specifics, in terms of the tools, how should civil society now, at the moment, how should we respond to the challenge of engaging and interrogating policy, spending, and action from government today? How should we begin to engage that challenge today?
So it's a few days ago, I think on Thursday, I was involved in a webinar that the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa organized. It was on responses of different countries to the fight against COVID-19. And they drew from comparative experience. They actually had the foreign minister of Spain come to
Okay.
give the keynote speech. And the first thing she said about what they have learned from responding to
COVID.
COVID-19 is humility.
Hmm.
Humility to admit that we don't have all the answers. Humility to know that no one country, no matter how well resourced, can effectively deal with this pandemic without solidarity and multilateralism that multilateral organizations provide. And that no one citizen in any country can be safe from this disease if there are citizens in other countries that are impacted. How
Yes.
do this relate to the question you asked? How they relate is that those of us in the citizen sector, especially the organized one, there is what William Easterly calls the he called it the repression of the expert. I'm trying to get the exact title of the book he wrote, but what he's saying is that we're living in a world where a group of people, in the name of experts, claim to know it all, and that can engage the government on behalf of the people, come up with all the answers to the questions, and that all government needs to do is implement them without
Yes.
reference to the people. And
Yes.
my question to the leaders of he called it, I've remembered the
Tyranny
title,
of yes
tyranny
of
of the
the
experts.
yes. It's
So
tend to
in
be
our
that.
context, you may think that we actually have we are suffering from tyranny of civil society leaders. Many of them have lost the organic link with the mass and are not able, they have no pipeline, no framework, no structure from gauging the pulse of the people in terms of what the people need that will inform and enrich the engagement and the demands they make on the government. In fact, we joke when we are in the civil society movement that will say we are representing poor people, that the day we see the real poor Nigerians, we will all take to our heels, and that that tells you a lot about how far we have gone away from that. So engaging government requires first understanding where the people are, what their needs are about this period of time. And if we truly understand them, some of the things we are pushing and supporting government to implement, we will call for caution. will call for greater engagement. I think we need to find a way. Today we have the technologies of consultations, but the technology of participation is dwindling, which is what I call is a paradox of increasing participation and declining representation. Many of us claim to speak on behalf of the people, but we don't truly represent the people. Because if you say you are representing me and you come up with this approach to solving my problem, I say, hang on a moment, that approach will not work. How many of us will agree with the people and say the approach we provide, we produce fancy slides and all of that will not work? That is actually this other one that looks messy that will work because that's what people think and believe will work. So I want us to take a step back. Instead of going forward to continue to pile up these suggestions and fancy slides about how we'll get out of this, we should go back to consultations and agree that we don't even know what we're talking about and be
Right.
humble to be informed. Because I saw a video on Facebook 2 days ago where somebody was talking about the level of suffering in the land. And he said, if you are able to afford 3 square meals and you are eating 3 square meals today, and there is nobody you are helping, nobody you are giving up 1 meal a day to give that person a helping hand, that you're actually wicked. And I would say in many ways, many of us are operating in a manner that suggests we are wicked because we don't really understand what people are going through at this moment. And that is what we are required to do in order to better represent them or actually create the space for them to go and
Them
speak
to
for themselves.
that's powerful. That's powerful. I'm going to take, we have about 7 minutes more, so I'm going to take a question. If anybody has a question, please share that question. If you have a question, just share it in the comment box, and I will take the question. Just quickly, before I ask a question, I want to ask a troublesome question. Yeah. Sometimes I mean, listening to the things you're saying here, sometimes watching you on, reading your tweets on social media, I'm like, you know, in my mind, I say, you are this is you are a funder, and but also you are still actively activisting, so to speak. Doesn't that put you in trouble sometimes in conversations, in meetings where you're having these, you know, super conversations about how to allocate resources in a space like Nigeria? Do you find that you get into trouble when you make statements like this? Do you find that you get into trouble when you question the status quo and the establishment that perhaps you are also a part of?
No, actually, before I joined Ford, I knew Ford as a social justice philanthropy. And social justice philanthropy is a kind of philanthropy that is not content with dealing with symptoms. We are interested in addressing the root causes of the problems that we try to solve through our programming. And we know that the major root cause of some of the social problems, in fact, many of the social problems we're dealing with today, is inequality. And it's not just inequality of income or inequality of wealth, it's actually inequality of voice, inequality of educational attainment, inequality of participation, and the fact that everything has been commoditized and industries have been created around anything. So on the surface, you think things are moving, but they are still where they
Moving.
are. So
Yeah,
working in
yeah.
that kind of environment and under the kind of leadership that we have in the foundation gives one the courage and the space, to do some of the things I do and you know share my views the way I share them. I'm not saying that it might not in some way, draw eyebrows and all of that, but I do what I do because it's what I believe in it. And any day it doesn't work, something will give. But I'm mindful of my mandate in the region, and the foundation also knows why it hires people who come from the countries where the offices are located. Because also in time past, many of the regional representatives of the foundation and other foundations come from the West. I'm actually the first Nigerian to be the representative of Ford
Yes.
in West Africa.
Yes.
And that is a statement that you are hiring somebody who has a voice. Because what we give goes beyond the funding. We bring to the table much more than the little funding we have. We bring convening power, we bring knowledge of the region, we bring experience of people whom we hire who have been involved in these issues for many decades.
Yeah. Fantastic. We're about to end, but Benga took my last question out of my mouth and organized it properly. So I'm going to take that. How do we get back, practically, how do we get back to the coordinated, organized civil society, given the many silos? And there is a question, there's a B part to that. And given current complexities, should these coordinated networks be subnational, national, or regional?
I think it should be all of the above, but it begins with the recognition. I made allusions to this earlier, but let me restate it. No one organization, no matter how well resourced or organized it is, can push the needle on the problems we are confronted today in the Nigerian society or even in the world. So realizing that forces a humility that we need to work together. The second is when you are focused on the mission rather than the organization, it compels you to reach out to other organizations that have similar missions and bond to them to achieve the common goals that you guys share. And that coordination and that organizing should happen at the national, subnational, and even the local levels. It should be possible for people within a ward to come together to address problems that affect people at that ward level. And building from there to local, to state, to national, to regional, and global. Because in the past, we had groups and networks here that not only engage locally and nationally, but we are also involved in the global struggle. Nigeria has completely withdrawn today from the international arena, not just at the political leadership level, but even more so at the level of civil society organizing. There was a time when, if you go to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, majority of the resolutions that they adopted were based on petitions from Nigeria. Today, Nigeria is absent, and that absence spread across sectors.
Fantastic. Like when guys say, please say it loud for those of us at the back. I think that, this conversation has taken us to different places that I think should be more deeply explored, even beyond this pandemic and beyond COVID. Essentially, what you've said is that the symptoms that we've seen in the lack of a robust response to this pandemic speak to underlying issues with the structure and flexibility of civil society in and of itself. So dealing with the symptoms alone will not help. We need to have a first principles discussion about where the links began to weaken. And I think that's a conversation I would like to have more of. Wengasha, I'm going to send you a text message. This is a conversation I want to have more of. Thank you so much for joining us on the Call of Duty conversation Instagram Live with Chude. Thank you very much, sir. This has been deeply enlightening. Thank you to everyone who stayed with us from the beginning to the end. I will see you again tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Thank you, sir. Have a fantastic week. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, and well done for doing this.
Thank you.